Mayday, mayday. This is Air Transat Flight 236. We're flying over the Atlantic, and we are completely out of fuel. Imagine being thousands of feet in the air, with 293 passengers on board, halfway across the ocean, and suddenly, your fuel tanks run dry. The lights go out, the engines fail, and the crew is scrambling to prepare for an emergency landing. But where? They're over nothing but water, and time is running out. This is the real-life nightmare faced by the crew and passengers of the Air Transat Flight 236 on August 24, 2001. Today, we'll take you on the inside of this incredible story of survival, one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. Air Transat Flight 236 took off from Toronto Pearson International Airport in Canada, bound for Lisbon, Portugal. It was a typical long-haul transatlantic flight with 293 passengers and 13 crew members on board, expected to last for 7 hours. The aircraft for this journey was an Airbus A330-200, a modern wide-body plane known for its reliability. At the helm were two experienced pilots. First, the captain, Robert Pichet, who was 48 years old and had over 16,800 flight hours under his belt. His first officer, Dirk de Jager, was younger but highly capable, with nearly 5,000 hours of flying experience. They were scheduled for a smooth 7-hour journey across the Atlantic, but what started as a routine flight would soon turn into one of the most dramatic emergencies in modern aviation history, and all down to improper aircraft maintenance. Just 4 days before the flight, the aircraft had undergone routine checks, during which a critical engine part had been replaced. What no one knew at the time was that a small but significant error during this maintenance would set the stage for the crisis that followed. The first few hours of the flight went smoothly. The Airbus A330 was cruising at 39,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. However, 3 hours into the flight, things started to take a strange turn. The first sign of trouble appeared when the pilots noticed something unusual on their engine displays. The oil pressure in the right engine was abnormally high, paired with a drop in oil temperature. This didn't make sense. Normally, during long flights, oil temperatures rise, but here, they were quickly dropping. Captain Pichet and the first officer de Jager scanned their instruments, puzzled by the data. Unsure of what was going on, they checked their flight manuals but found no clear explanation. They reported the issue to their maintenance control center on the ground, but even the experts there couldn't identify the cause. Unknown to the crew, a massive fuel leak was already happening in the right engine. A critical mistake during the engine replacement back in Toronto had placed the fuel and hydraulic lines too close together, and over the course of the flight, the high-pressure hydraulic lines wore down the fuel tube, eventually causing it to rupture. Fuel was now gushing out of the aircraft at an alarming rate, nearly 12 tons per hour. But with all the fuel tanks designed with the plane transferring automatically, the crew had no idea what was happening. As the fuel drained rapidly, the aircraft continued flying normally. The systems weren't designed to detect a leak of this magnitude. Instead, the pilots were only seeing confusing engine data, fuel imbalances between the tanks, without any obvious signs of a leak. So, they simply believed the issue was related to the engine oil and continued to troubleshoot, unaware that time and fuel were quickly running out. It wasn't long before another warning flashed across their instruments. It was a fuel imbalance between the left and right wings. Still, there was no indication that a fuel leak was to blame. Captain Pichet and Officer de Jager decided to manually correct the imbalance. They opened the crossfeed valve, which allowed fuel from the left wing to flow into the right wing. But this decision, meant to solve the problem, only made things worse. With the crossfeed valve open, the remaining fuel from the left wing was now being diverted straight into the ruptured fuel line, which ultimately accelerated the leak. Within minutes, the fuel levels dropped dangerously low. The situation had gone from confusing to critical. They were flying over the middle of the Atlantic, hours away from the nearest airport, with less and less fuel to get them there. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, the pilots quickly searched for alternate landing sites. The closest option was Lajes Air Base on the Azores Islands, still hundreds of kilometers away. They had no choice but to attempt a diversion and hope they had enough fuel left to make it. However, just as they made the decision to head towards Lajes, disaster struck. The right engine suddenly flamed out, completely shutting down due to the lack of fuel. Now, with only one engine left, Captain Pichet and Officer de Jager knew they were in serious trouble. And then, just minutes later, the left engine also flamed out. Both engines were dead. The Airbus A330, once a powerful transatlantic aircraft, was now nothing more than a glider, descending rapidly toward the vast Atlantic Ocean below. As if things couldn't possibly get worse, the unthinkable then happened. Suddenly, the cabin pressure dropped and everything changed immediately. First, the lights inside the aircraft flickered and went out, leaving passengers and the crew in a cold, terrifying void and causing huge panic. In the cockpit, Captain Pichet and First Officer de Jager fought to maintain control, but without power, they were flying blind. With both engines gone and the Airbus A330 now gliding silently through the night sky, Captain Pichet and First Officer de Jager were left with an impossible task: land a powerless 200-ton aircraft safely in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Without engine power, they had lost nearly all of the plane's vital systems, including the thrust, electrical power, and hydraulic controls. But amidst the chaos, one final lifeline remained: the ram air turbine, a small emergency propeller beneath the aircraft. As the wind rushed past the plane, the turbine generated just enough power to keep a few essential systems running, although barely enough to guide them through this crisis. The pilots knew they couldn't stay in the air forever. At 39,000 feet, the aircraft was descending fast. To buy as much time as possible, they aimed for the nearest land, Lajes Air Base on the Azores Islands. It was still over 100 kilometers away, and with no engines, the Airbus had to descend at just the right angle to stretch its remaining altitude. Too steep, and they would crash into the ocean. Too shallow, and they would fall short of the runway. With incredible focus, Captain Pichet kept the aircraft at the ideal gliding speed, balancing between maintaining altitude and avoiding a stall. Meanwhile, First Officer de Jager was busy monitoring what little information was left on the instruments. He constantly updated the captain on their altitude, airspeed, and distance to the Azores, knowing that any miscalculation could spell disaster. The two worked together with remarkable precision, their years of training and experience being pushed to the absolute limit. As the aircraft descended closer to the ocean, the runway lights of Lajes Air Base finally came into view, but the plane was still far too high. At 13,000 feet and just a few miles from the base, it appeared they were coming in too steep. In response, Captain Pichet decided to perform a full 360-degree turn, a risky but much-needed action. This would allow them to lose altitude without gaining too much speed. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance to make it to the runway. After successfully completing the 360-degree turn to lose altitude, they were still coming in too fast, and there was nothing left to do than to land immediately. At over 200 knots, which is much faster than a typical landing speed, they lined up with runway 33 at Lajes Air Base. Without the engines, critical systems like wing spoilers and thrust reversers, which are usually used to slow the plane down, were completely offline. All they had left were the brakes, and even those weren't working at full capacity. This was a captain's nightmare. As the runway lights grew larger in the windshield, First Officer de Jager lowered the landing gear. With no power, the gear dropped manually, locking into place with a thud. It was one of the few things still working. "Brace for impact," the cabin crew instructed the passengers, their voices steady despite the looming danger. At the last possible moment, the landing gear touched down very hard. The force of the landing was immense, causing the plane to bounce back into the air, and 8 out of the 12 tires to burst on impact. As it hit the ground a second time, the aircraft skidded across the runway with only 4 tires left. Then, the brakes also locked up, and inside the cockpit, Captain Pichet fought with the controls, trying to desperately keep the plane from traveling past the runway. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the Airbus A330 came to a full stop, just 600 feet from the end of the runway, and by then, fires had already broken out in the landing gear, worsening the situation. In the cabin, there was a moment of stunned silence. The passengers, still shaken, began to realize what had just happened. They were alive. Incredibly, after what seemed like certain doom, every single person on board had survived. But there was no time to celebrate. The crew quickly ordered an emergency evacuation, and within 90 seconds, all 293 passengers and 13 crew members had safely exited the plane. Fire crews were already on standby and rushed in to extinguish the flames before they could spread. But as relief settled in, people began to ask questions. How did the situation spiral out of control? And how did a modern aircraft lose all of its fuel mid-flight? In the days following the incident, investigators uncovered the critical mistake that led to the crisis. The engine replacement that had taken place just days before the flight had been done incorrectly. A fuel line had been placed too close to a hydraulic line, causing friction that eventually ruptured the fuel system mid-flight. For several hours, thousands of liters of fuel had silently leaked out into the atmosphere without any alarms going off. But that wasn't the only issue. The pilots, skilled as they were, had failed to recognize the signs of a fuel leak. The imbalance warnings and strange engine readings could have alerted them to the possibility of a major problem. But cognitive bias, where we see only what we expect or want to see, prevented them from considering that something far more serious was unfolding. Despite this rookie mistake, the incredible skill and composure of the two pilots on board could not be underestimated. Their courage and quick thinking earned them the Superior Airmanship Award from the Airline Pilots Association. And in the end, the story of Flight 236 reminds us of the thin line between disaster and survival, and how, in aviation, preparation and training can make the difference between life and death. It also teaches us the importance of constantly updating safety standards to ensure that such near tragedies are avoided in the future. If you found this story as incredible as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss other incredible aviation stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.